Van, and we're going to have a little panel discussion about everything to do with open banking. Hello, give them a big hand. I am going to stay on the stage this time and help them out a little bit, facilitate stuff. So let me just introduce you all to the team. So Kieran is a back-end engineer on open banking. He's been at Monzo for almost 2 years, where he's developed a number of product features that maybe some of you use, like IFT and shared tabs, upcoming payments, flux receipt integration, and external credit card integration. Kieran is now the team lead for open banking. And then we have Michael here, who is also a back-end engineer. Prior to working at Monzo, Michael worked at Plum. Anyone here know the app Plum? Yeah? A few people? Yep, cool. So he was there. And Plum is an app that uses open banking data to help people save. So Michael is now with us with his experience on working on lots of things with open banking. And finally, we have Alver here as well, also a back-end engineer. Lots of engineering in here today, but that's all good. He's been here for a year. During that time, he has worked on several product features like Pay by Link and led the development of our payment initiation APIs. Prior to Monzo, Alver worked at M&S and Moo, also with our CTO, Mary. So lots of relationships there. It's all good. So I think the best place to start, team, what is open banking? Let's just break it down to the simple basics.
Yeah, sure. I can have a go at answering that. So open banking is actually a very it's an overloaded term, so it can refer to like lots of different things, and I think it helps to be quite precise when talking about it. So it can refer to the PSD2 legislation. This is EU legislation brought in by the European Union that kind of started open banking off. In the UK, we might be referring to the Open Banking Implementation Entity. We sometimes call them Open Banking. This is a company that was set up by the Competition and Markets Authority to like standardize everything across all of the banks. But I think more generally, we're talking about the general concept of open banking. So this is the ability to give third parties access to your banking data and also to allow them to initiate payments on your behalf as well. And that's what we've been working on recently. I think as a bank, we also have to make this distinction. So Monzo as a bank, we have to provide this data to third parties for Monzo customers who want to do that. But as a bank, we're also, by default, an account information service provider. This means that we have the regulatory permissions that we need to pull data in from other institutions as well. And we can use both of those as part of open banking at Monzo.
So I think let's start there with talking about the way that we have to comply with that regulation to provide the data outside of Monzo. So you've all been working on getting our platform ready for open banking so our customers can share their Monzo data with the other third parties. How have you found working on that so far? What's the process been like?
Maybe I speak for myself, I'm not sure. I think it's been a challenge for us. So if we think about open banking at other banks, big banks, legacy banks, they have huge open banking teams. They throw hundreds of people at this problem. Monzo, it's us. It's literally us. It's considered bad practice for us to get into the lift together at the same time. Like that's how small our team is. So yeah, it's been a challenge. We've had to absorb, a lot of context just between us, and I think that's been, great for our personal development. But it's also been a real challenge. Yeah, sorry, Albert, come on.
Just, especially because we're all backend engineers, and it's a lot of regulation and things that we're not usually in other companies I've worked before. I didn't have to deal with these things, so it's a lot more than just writing code, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the best place to move forward with there is, because a lot of people probably, they may have heard the term open banking, but they may not understand the use cases for it. So let's talk about what things people can actually use open banking for today.
Sure, I think I can take this one. So I used to work at a company called Plum who provide like an app which lets you connect your bank account and essentially they monitor your transactions and kind of determine from how much balance you've got left in your account at like the end of the month, whether you can save a little bit of money extra. And really that's kind of like, it's one use case of this idea of sharing your banking data with more people than just your bank. So I think there are a lot of companies that do very similar things where you can like connect your bank account and maybe they give you budgeting advice, or maybe they tell you what kinds of loans you're eligible for. Or if you're a business, then there's a whole like a very like different world of use cases as well. I think open banking is very much a tool that you kind of like that is there and available now for lots of people, for different companies to think about and use as they wish. But ultimately, at its core, it's the ability to share what data you have and is typically in the past like hidden by your banks with other people.
So I think what some people might be aware of, and obviously what we're all aware of, but I think we should probably explain, is that open banking as a topic has kind of been a pressing subject in the last few months. Alver, would you maybe explain why it's become such a hot button topic recently?
Yeah, so the concept of sharing data is not necessarily new, and in fact Monzo had an API that did it before, and I'm sure you've seen apps like Emma or Yolt. They existed for quite a while now, but they mostly relied on you actually giving them your username and password for your bank, and then them going and trying to pretend they're you in a browser. Sounds a bit dangerous. So in 2015, the European Parliament passed a law called PSD2 that basically enforces, it makes it so that all banks are required to allow these things to be done securely. And this is where open banking was really born from. And the deadline for banks to implement this across Europe was the 14th of September, which was just a month ago. So
wasn't there an earlier deadline that was missed?
Yeah, so there was another deadline in March where you were supposed to have a test, sort of environment for parties to test. But the point is that all banks since 2 months ago are now forced to actually allow this. So that's probably why you've maybe seen in your banking apps suddenly everyone's talking about open banking.
So could you maybe explain to us, and any of you can take this, about what about open banking is different at Monzo? The way that how do we do it that's different to what other banks might be doing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're a much smaller team, and we're trying to take open banking and see how it fits into Monzo's product, and actually, do a good job of it. So, I mean, a lot of banks, they're doing this because they have to, and it's been forced on them. Whereas Monzo, as a company, was, when we were founded, we had an API from the very beginning. So, like, APIs are very important to us. And I think what a lot of banks do is they take the complexity of open banking and they push this straight onto the customer. So if you look at the connection flows, for example, you'll see that it's like new open banking connection, learn more about open banking. And really, open banking is jargon. It's like the legal, regulatory, and technical framework that enables this data sharing, but they push all of this complexity onto the customer. So we've tried to design our open banking flows with this in mind, properly. Yeah.
I think Kieran mentioning jargon there is quite an interesting one because it's such a hot topic for us at Monzo, where we don't like this idea of like forcing what can be very complex technical things onto our users. And I'm not sure about for you two, but I have never worked in an area that is so like full of acronyms and like terrifying laws, like 100-page documents that you have to read, which is just like incredibly complex, but often say very little. So this was definitely a pretty interesting experience for us as well, of diving deep into something that is like so hugely technical and legal. It's like having to read your whole like tenancy document front to back like 100 times just to make sure you know exactly what's going on every time.
Yeah, so sometimes you have to read like 100 pages just to learn the jargon that you can then use and read the actual law. It's kind of terrifying.
Do you remember when we were reading, we actually read these laws, so we tried to get a detailed understanding, and occasionally there's some like ambiguity in the law. So like we read the law in English, and there was some like ambiguous sentence, and we had to translate it into Spanish. So they have, because it's EU regulation, they have it in all different languages, and we read it in Spanish just to try and get clarity. So sometimes it can be really difficult to understand the law, but I think it's so important that we as engineers understand that so we can apply it and actually build good products.
Let's talk a little bit about how open banking, we touched on this earlier, but maybe in a little bit more detail, about how we see it fitting into the long-term vision of what we do at Monzo.
Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, right? Because kind of like I said earlier, open banking is just a tool. And providing an API for people to access their own data and also for companies to access their own data is something that Monzo's been doing for ages, right? We fundamentally believe in this openness and sharing of what essentially belongs to our users, right? Their own data. That being said, like on the, Monzo is providing these APIs for other banks, but we can, as Kieran said at the very beginning, we can also act as a consumer of these APIs from other banks. And that's something that actually Kieran and I were exploring kind of towards the beginning of this year with the external credit cards integration. Like, what if you could take your credit card and view all of its data inside the Monzo app? Like, I personally, I've got an American Express card, and I don't particularly like using the American Express app. It doesn't feel as friendly as the Monzo app to me. So the ability to like connect to a credit card provider and see your balance and transactions from within Monzo, and maybe like be able to pay off your card directly, or at least see how much you're going to be spending at the end of the month and put it into a pot. That's a really appealing thing for me personally. And I think that there are teams across Monzo now which are all thinking about how we can use banking data from other banks in a way to make everyone's lives just a little bit easier. And it kind of comes back to that whole like financial control center idea, where it's not about like making sure that you put all of your money into Monzo directly and buy only products that we offer. It's about this openness of data and being able to visualize your finances in one place.
We should probably mention as well that it's not just about sharing data. Some of the regulation also requires us to allow third parties to initiate payments, which is a whole other side of open banking. And even for Monzo, when acting as a third party, things like when you open a Monzo account, we want users to, as early as possible, move their salary into Monzo. But this is a scary step to make, because the official government sort of sanctioned process for this is called a CAS, which effectively closes your bank account. I'm sure some of the audience have done that. A lot of users are reluctant to do this, and we can actually use open banking as a third party to initiate payments, to say, well, we can see when you get paid in your other bank account. Hey, do you want to move your salary here every month without necessarily having to move everything and close your other account? So there's a lot of interesting use cases.
Yeah, I think we saw earlier in Tom's keynote and also in the Monzo 3.0 panel, just how we've like redesigned the entire app. And I think that's really to lay the foundations for this kind of account aggregation offering.
Could you talk a little bit about what kind of groundwork we're laying right now for that long-term vision?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't know who's seen this, because it wasn't really released to all customers, but we have put it on our forums and social media and stuff. We basically started this account aggregation thing using TrueLayer as our partner, but I think we were just a bit too early. So when we started, we basically went down the screen scraping route, which is like entirely legal, like it's sanctioned. But what we found was that this was kind of very unreliable, and also users were not super keen on giving their entire set of banking credentials, even though it is secure. So we kind of put that work on pause to focus on our own interface. But I think we should really revisit that soon. Yeah.
In fact, yesterday we were talking with some other teams about like what they might do with these APIs as well. So I think we were talking to like the salary squad about how, like Albert was saying, how you might want to be able to visualize not just credit cards but current accounts within the Monzo app as well. And I think we've been talking to the savings squad about the ability to like move savings accounts information at least over into Monzo, just so that you can aggregate things. Like it's good to have one place where you can see your financial life.
I think also this is where doing things in-house is a real competitive advantage, because most of our banks outsource the work to implement open banking to external agencies. And so if they now want to do account aggregation within their apps, they don't have the expertise for it, whereas because we've implemented this on our side, we're in a perfect position to now go and actually use that expertise to act as a third party, which opens a lot of opportunities.
For better or for worse, the gory details of how all of this works is now stuck in our minds.
Very much.
So given that open banking is, it's a regulation, it's not something that we designed the idea of, and although we're in control of the ways that we implement it, we still have to adhere to certain things. So based on that, what are the limitations that you might have found or run into that you think could potentially hinder the success, and maybe things that we wouldn't have put in place if it was something that we'd built?
Yeah, so it's a strange one really, because these open banking APIs, they're standardized across all of the legacy banks. So sometimes it feels like they've been designed for those banks. So for example, there's, I think encoded within the law is this limitation that you can't fetch the data more than 4 times per day, which is really strange. And also there's some information in the law about the frequency, or should I say like the duration for which your consents last. So every 90 days, you have to like reconfirm that you still want this company to access your data. And I think this is, broadly speaking, a good thing for customers. I think the idea is to prevent another sort of Cambridge Analytica style scandal. But we're kind of wondering, is that trade-off right? Is 90 days too short? So yeah, I guess we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
You got anything to add?
I would say that right now, at least, it's definitely still a very like juvenile technology. Like Albert was saying, the deadline was only like a month and a half ago, and even deadlines to companies always feel slightly different to like deadlines when it's homework. Where like I don't know, if you're a company and you have a deadline, sometimes you just kind of like watch them go, and we've definitely seen that with some other implementations when we're kind of testing them out as a third party ourselves. And it's something that we're very wary of, and I feel like it would be. I think there is a future where like some of this jankiness goes away, and you can start fetching your current account balance from another bank more than 4 times a day. But for now, there are definitely limitations. But it's down to us to figure out ways to work around them.
Yeah, I think some of the limitations are like not even technical either. They're like cultural. So I go to these open banking meetings and sit there with all of the banks and all of the third parties together in one room, and the atmosphere is so tense. Like nobody trusts each other. So I think we've got a lot of work to do to kind of improve that as well, and actually restore trust. And I think what we've tried to do as an open banking team is kind of show that it's possible to bring everything in house, to like I guess run it competently, respond to feedback from third parties as well.
But the free food at those meetings is pretty great.
Yeah, the food is good, yeah.
To go back to what you said before, is that at the end of the day, most banks implemented this because they were forced to implement this, not because they wanted to implement this. And so, when you're in these meetings where all of these representatives are going there, and what they're really trying to find out is what is the least amount of work they can do to get away with it. It's not the best environment to, do business, I suppose.
Yeah.
So to kind of finish off the talk, I think for good reason, financial services have been slow to kind of adapt to this new model that we have in society where data is kind of flowing around a lot more freely than it used to be. And we've seen in the last few years, and particularly since referendums and elections and things like that, how things can go wrong when data sharing is kind of abused. So based on that, what should users be cautious of when they're having to adapt to open banking and using these kind of services?
I think at the end of the day, you're consenting to share your data with a third party, like with a company that you don't necessarily know everything about. And so the usual prudence applies there, right? Where you need to know exactly what it is you're sharing. And there are definitely safeguards within like the open banking legislation and within its implementation in the UK that say that when you're sharing your data with a company via open banking, they have to tell you exactly which bits of data that they want to use, and they also you have the right to know exactly which company has access to this data as well. And I think ultimately it's one of those things where it's boring and it's dull, but you do have to read the fine print on this stuff. And I think it's definitely worth being cautious when you're consenting to share what is incredibly private data. Like this is the data that typically affects how eligible you are for a loan, or like whether or not you can, other things like whether you can rent somewhere. So it's definitely something that we'll keep an eye on as well. Like we're kind of, it's a concern for us as consumers as well as a bank. And I think that's it's very important just to keep an eye out.
I suppose, in the same way, if you install an app that's meant to be a flashlight app and it only asks for permissions to, read your storage and see all of your contacts, and you get a bit suspicious. If you're installing an app that's meant to display your transactions, but suddenly it's asking for permissions to make payments and all sorts of strange things, that be mindful of these things. Don't just accept because you're sharing valuable, important data.
Yeah, I think all of the different AISPs and PIS, so these are just 2 acronyms: Account Information Service Provider, Payment Initiation Service Provider. They're so called because they are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. So like in order to use these open banking APIs, you need to you need to satisfy the regulator that you're doing everything, above board and properly. And so I think that's an important safeguard to have for customers. I also think it's a double-edged sword because it means that innovative open banking use cases maybe won't be served because getting that license, it actually takes time, it takes money. So this is like part of the reason why we invested in things like if this then that. So customers who would like to use an API but don't know how to code, they can do things like that themselves.
I think that pretty much covers all the basics. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about to do with open banking while we're here?
You mentioned the referendum. I saw a question on Twitter about, this is a European law, so what happens if there were, God forbid, a no-deal Brexit? And the answer is that actually this law is written into UK law, so whether we're in the EU or not, it doesn't actually matter. The FCA actually released a note just yesterday on clarifying what would actually happen if there was a no-deal exit, and the only change is that the limits on transactions that are currently specified in euros are now specified in pounds, and everything else stays the same. So no change there.
A little bit of good news in that area.
I think this has been such a big change for all of us because all three of us, we're all back-end engineers, and we're all used to working in like a product environment. So this is where you build a feature for the app, you release it to customers, and then you get this instant feedback. And also you get a lot of attention from the media and things like that. So we're kind of used to getting this recognition, and then we've moved into this team where it's all of the work that you're doing is in the background, and that's been a bit of a I don't know, I guess a culture shock for us. It's been great for our personal development, just very different. So it's actually really nice just to be able to come here and talk about what we've been working on for the past 6 months, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Open Banking team. That was very, very informative. Get a big So now